William Shakespeare was born to John Shakespeare and Mary Arden. Though his actual date of birth is not known, it is traditionally observed on April 23, 1564. As per church records, he was baptized on April 26, 1564. He was the third child and the eldest son of the couple who had 8 offspring. Little is known of Shakespeare's childhood and education. It is speculated that he attended the King's New School in Stratford, where he learned to read and write. Since all the grammar schools then followed the same curricula, it is believed that he received intensive education in grammar based upon Latin classical authors. In 1582, when he was just 18, Shakespeare married Anne Hathaway, a woman 8 years his senior. They would have 3 children, a daughter in 1583 and a set of twins in 1585. They lost their only son, Hamnet, when the boy was 11 years old. Daughters Susanna and Judith would live to be 66 and 77, respectively. From 1586 until 1592, very little information is available regarding the Shakespeare household or the bard himself. During this period that historians refer to as the writer's lost years, only a scant legal document or two gives evidence of Shakespeare's existence. Over the years, various biographers have speculated that he may have been a poacher on the run from a disgruntled landowner, a horse minder at a London theatre, or more probably, a local schoolmaster. Also during his lost years, the bard was devoting a good portion of his time to playwriting. By 1592, solid evidence shows that one if not more of his plays was underway on London stages. The first of his plays in production was probably Henry IV, Part 1, an historical work which not only chronicles the active years of the monarch's reign but also introduces his son Hal and Henry Percy, or Hotspur, a rival. The bard had established himself in London prior to 1592, as evidenced by a mention in the London Times by a fellow playwright. He completed Henry IV, Part 2, and Henry V early in the 1590s. By 1594, he and a group of colleagues had formed an acting troupe they called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, in honor of their patron, which would soon grow to prominence in the London theatre scene. The 1590s were quite a prolific time for Shakespeare. He wrote additional historic plays, including Richard II, Richard III, and Titus Andronicus. He also penned the comedies Two Gentlemen of Verona, The Taming of the Shrew, and A Comedy of Errors, probably early in the decade. From around 1595 to the end of the century, Shakespeare turned his sights toward more romantic comedies, including A Midsummer Night's Dream, The Merchant of Venice, Twelfth Night, and Much Ado About Nothing. The bard wrote the tragedies Romeo and Juliet, and Julius Caesar, during this period of his life as well. By 1597, Shakespeare had written approximately 15 of his 38 surviving plays. He had achieved enough financial success to purchase one of Stratford's nicest homes for his family. He continued to live principally in London where he wrote and acted in his plays. During periods such as Lent, when theatres were closed and when outbreaks of the plague shut down the city, he likely spent time with his family in Stratford. Shakespeare was not only writing scripts for his company, often based on stories from mythology, literature and historic accounts, but he was also acting in his own plays. The Lord Chamberlain's Men put on performances at such London venues as the Theatre and the Curtain. In 1599, the acting troupe built the Globe from the ruins of the theatre, establishing their own playhouse, which opened in 1599. Early in the new century, the bard continued to produce great literature, penning such masterworks as Troilus and Cressida, Measure for Measure, All's Well That Ends Well, and some of his most renowned tragedies, including Hamlet, Othello, and King Lear. In 1603, the Lord Chamberlain's Men delivered a command performance of A Midsummer Night's Dream at Queen Elizabeth's Hampton Court. When the Queen died later that year, the acting troupe changed its name to the King's Men in honor of the newly crowned King James I. Their first performance for the monarch was As You Like It. The bard was growing artistically during this era, customizing his mastery of blank verse with wit and intention to enrich his characters' dialogue and enliven the action. He employed such techniques as run-on lines and inflected phrasing to breathe life into a poetic form that tended to the monotone if used within strict parameters of 10 syllables per line and alternating stressed and unstressed syllables. The dialogue of his play, Hamlet, for example, seems animated in comparison to the more strictly patterned lines of earlier works such as Henry V. Shakespeare also provided moments of variation in his plays by inserting bits of rhymed verse in the dialogue, for example in Puck's epilogue in A Midsummer Night's Dream. During the first decade of the 17th century, Shakespeare published his Sonnets, a collection of 154 14-line works that employed the same blank verse format as his plays but with the specific rhyme scheme of 3 quatrains and a concluding couplet. Released as a printed collection in 1609, Shakespeare's sonnets had likely been written individually over time, and those within his circle of friends were probably already familiar with some of them. The form the bard employed for his verses became known as the Shakespearean sonnet, as opposed to the traditional Petrarchan sonnet, which consists of an octet and a sestet. In his last plays, Cymbeline, A Winter's Tale, and The Tempest, the bard test drove a hybrid genre, the tragicomedy, also known as the romance. While they take a more somber, serious tone than such comedies as Twelfth Night, these tragicomedies end on a positive note, unlike such tragedies as King Lear. The bard also completed 2 last works for theatre, Henry VIII and The Two Noble Kinsmen, with a collaborator, likely John Fletcher, a contemporary playwright. Just after the completion of Henry VIII in 1613, the King's Men lost the Globe Playhouse to a fire. By the time they reopened in 1614, Shakespeare had already retired to his family home in Stratford, where he died in 1616 at the age of 52. While no verified version of the manner of his death exists today, one account, written by the vicar of Stratford 50 years later, attributes his untimely demise to drinking too hard with his friends John Drayton and Ben Jonson, and catching a fatal fever as a result. Due in part to the great gaps in knowledge regarding Shakespeare's early education and the lost years, the bard has always been shrouded in mystery. In addition, not a single manuscript he wrote in his own hand survived the centuries. One scholarly explanation for this lack of historical verification is that William Shakespeare was the pen name of some more illustrious, well-educated figure of the Elizabethan era. The controversy did not see the light of day until more than 2 centuries after the bard's death. Among the first to question the authorship of such all-time great works as Macbeth was a Pennsylvanian Lutheran named Samuel Schmucker, and he was merely drawing an analogy. He likened the scholarly trend of his time in using historic data to raise doubts about the existence of Christ was akin to speculating that Shakespeare never existed. An offhand remark, but that is all it took to sow the seed of controversy. Some of the fuel for the fire included, the lack of documentation for Shakespeare's existence, the disputed authorship of particular works and the unlikelihood that someone with the bard's background would rise to greatness. Among the most famous doubters were Mark Twain, Henry James, Sigmund Freud and Orson Welles. Among the candidates people have mentioned as the real William Shakespeare are Sir Francis Bacon, Christopher Marlowe, and Earl of Oxford Edward de Vere. The controversy has even found its way into the U.S. Supreme Court as the subject of a moot debate. One of the bard's most enduring influences is on the English language. Not only are many quotes from his plays, such as Polonius' advice to Hamlet, "Neither a borrower nor a lender be," a part of the English lexicon, but the way in which Shakespeare shaped the language to suit his own artistic purposes would influence future writers and poets throughout subsequent history, from Charles Dickens to Maya Angelou. Charles Dickens drew upon the bard's writings for many of his titles as well as numerous quotations he used within his novels. Shakespeare also enriched the language with the addition of approximately 2,000 new words and numerous new usages of existing vocabulary. Some of the words attributed to the bard include auspicious, dwindle, and sanctimonious. Phrases he originated that are still in the popular lexicon include, break the ice from The Taming of the Shrew and in a pickle from The Tempest. Shakespeare died on the 23rd of April 1616, at the age of 52. He died within a month of signing his will, a document which he begins by describing himself as being in perfect health. No extant contemporary source explains how or why he died. Half a century later, John Ward, the vicar of Stratford, wrote in his notebook, Shakespeare, Drayton, and Ben Jonson had a merry meeting and, it seems, drank too hard, for Shakespeare died of a fever there contracted, not an impossible scenario since Shakespeare knew Jonson and Drayton. He was survived by his wife and 2 daughters. Susanna had married a physician, John Hall, in 1607, and Judith had married Thomas Quinney, a vintner, 2 months before Shakespeare's death. Shakespeare signed his last will and testament on 25 March 1616. The following day, his new son-in-law, Thomas Quinney, was found guilty of fathering an illegitimate son by Margaret Wheeler, who had died during childbirth. Thomas was ordered by the church court to do public penance, which would have caused much shame and embarrassment for the Shakespeare family.